In the winter of 1872, the streets of Dresden carried a quiet that belonged to old cities, where carriages clipped along cobblestones and the smell of coal smoke lingered in the air. The snow had fallen heavily that year, gathering on rooftops, bending branches, muffling every sound. Behind the tall windows of the Voss estate, the world seemed untouched by the cold. Curtains were drawn thick to keep out the drafts. Fires burned in carved marble hearths, and the servants moved carefully, their steps silent against the wooden floors. To those looking from the outside, the Voss family appeared whole, blessed with wealth, stability, and a certain kind of grace. But inside, there was a quiet current, a tension that could not be heard or named, but could be felt in the way conversations slowed and eyes lingered too long. The estate itself was old, a sprawling house built of stone, lined with ivy that clung stubbornly even in the dead of winter. It had stood for more than a century, filled with portraits of ancestors whose faces looked down with unyielding eyes, painted in an age when family honor was worth more than anything. Those paintings lined the halls, gazing silently at the living, as though keeping watch over secrets not meant to be spoken. Among them were faces of women, stiff and pale, their lips closed tight, their hands folded neatly in their laps. To visitors, they were works of art. To Emma Voss, mistress of the house, there was something more, a reminder of what it meant to be remembered, even in death. Emma was a woman who seemed carved from the same stone as the house she kept. Tall, with a face sharpened by age and loss, she carried herself with a kind of quiet authority that left little room for opposition. Her words were rarely harsh, yet no one doubted her control. She believed in order, in appearances, in the weight of tradition that pressed down on her. Family name. Every detail mattered to her. How the silver was placed on the table, how the curtains fell, how her daughter's hair was combed before leaving the house. To her, life was a portrait, and it had to be arranged just right. Her daughter, Clara, was the light within that cold house. Barely 17, with pale skin and dark hair that fell like silk against her shoulders, she carried a gentleness that seemed to belong to another world. She had none of her mother's severity, none of the stiffness that lived in the portraits on the wall. There was laughter in her voice, curiosity in her questions, a longing for freedom that reached beyond the walls of the estate. To those who saw her, she seemed almost untouched by the heaviness of her mother's rule, though in truth, she lived beneath it every day. Life in the Voss estate followed its rhythms like clockwork. Meals were taken at the same times, prayers spoken before bed, and letters written on Sundays. Servants polished silver, lit fires, and cleared away the snow from the stone steps. Clara attended lessons, embroidery, and music, watched closely by her governess, who reported every small detail back to Emma. The girl longed for more than this cycle of duty and silence. She would linger at the windows, staring at the city streets, where children her age walked with friends, their laughter carrying up through the frost. Sometimes she would sneak books under her covers, novels forbidden by her mother, stories of love, tragedy, and escape. Those books gave her a world beyond the heavy walls, though she knew she could never live in it. The Voss family carried its own share of shadows. Emma's husband had died years earlier, leaving her the sole keeper of the estate and its fortune. Some whispered that grief had turned her inward, making her stricter, harder. Others believed she had always been that way, even before loss shaped her face into something unyielding. What could not be denied was her devotion to her daughter. To Emma, Clara was both treasure and possession, something she had given life to, and something she could not bear to lose control over. That control often surfaced in ways that felt more like obsession than care. Clara's movements were monitored, her interactions controlled, her choices quietly erased before they could take root. If she laughed too loudly, Emma would quiet her. If she lingered too long on an idea, Emma would dismiss it. It was never framed as cruelty, never spoken of as punishment. To Emma, it was protection. Protection from the dangers of the outside world, from the men who might harm her, from the choices that might bring disgrace. Yet beneath that protection was a force that tightened around Clara like a noose, pulling her closer, keeping her still. Those who visited the estate noticed the strangeness. Friends of Clara spoke of her pale face, her silence in her mother's presence. Servants whispered in the kitchens about the way Emma's eyes followed the girl, never letting her out of sight. But no one spoke these things aloud beyond those walls. Families of wealth were allowed their eccentricities, and the Voss name carried too much weight to invite questions. Still, beneath the quiet routines, something darker was building. The house was filled with the smell of oil paint, the canvases set up in Emma's private study, where no one but she and Clara entered. Emma had taken up painting in her grief, they said, though she painted not landscapes or still lives, but faces. Faces that seemed too real, too alive. And more often than not, the face was Clara's. The girl would sit for hours under her mother's gaze, the brush moving across the canvas while silence filled the room. To Emma, it was art, memory, devotion. To Clara, it was another kind of prison, one she could not escape. The city outside carried on, unaware of the tension growing within those walls. The bells of Dresden's churches rang out each Sunday. Markets are filled with chatter. The river Elbe flowed, dark and endless. But inside the estate, time felt different, heavier, as though waiting for something to break. The servants noticed the way Emma's eyes lingered longer on Clara, the way her hands tightened around the brush, as though afraid to let go. They saw the way Clara's laughter had quieted, the way her shoulders bent under a weight she could not name. Nothing in those days seemed extraordinary from the outside. A wealthy mother and her daughter. A house filled with silence. A routine that never broke. But those who were closest could sense it. That fragile line between devotion and obsession, between protection and control, was beginning to blur. And though no one could have known it yet, the house that had stood for centuries was about to bear witness to a crime that would stain the Voss name forever. The winter slowly gave way to a pale spring, but the cold inside the Voss house did not ease. The snow outside melted, dripping from the edges of rooftops, turning the streets of Dresden into mud and slush. The carriages splashed dirty water as they passed, the river swelled with thaw, and the air smelled of damp earth. Yet in the estate, the rhythm of life was unchanged, its order unbroken, except for the growing unease that pressed closer with each passing week. Emma's gaze on her daughter became heavier, and Clara's silences grew longer. What had once been subtle shall now seem to fill every room like smoke, invisible but choking. It began with small things. Clara had been invited by a school friend, Lisbeth, to a gathering in the city, an afternoon of music at her family's home, nothing scandalous, nothing unusual. When she told her mother, Emma's lips tightened, and her eyes narrowed just enough to carry a warning. "A gathering?" she asked, her voice calm, but edged with something that froze Clara where she stood. "What do you imagine people will say if the daughter of the Voss house is seen among that crowd? Laughter, chatter, foolishness, it cheapens you." Clara tried to explain that it was only music, that it was harmless, but Emma's refusal was final. "Your place is here," she said, and with that, Clara's chance at escape vanished. What might have been only disappointment deepened into something sharper. Clara began to realize that her mother's refusals were not random. They were rooted in a need to keep her entirely within reach. Each time Clara showed interest in the world beyond their gates, Emma cut it down, offering reasons of safety, propriety, or duty. But beneath the words lay something unspoken. Emma could not bear to see her daughter belong to anyone or anything beyond herself. The first real crack appeared when Clara began exchanging letters with Lisbeth in secret. The notes were harmless, written in a hurried hand, hidden beneath floorboards or behind books. They spoke of dresses, novels, fleeting gossip, ordinary things. But to Clara, those letters were a lifeline, proof that another life existed beyond the suffocating walls. One afternoon, as she slipped one into her gown, Emma noticed the edge of paper. Without a word, she took it, unfolded it, and read. Clara stood frozen as her mother's eyes scanned the page, her face growing stiller by the second. Then Emma folded it, set it on the table, and said only, "Do not disgrace yourself with childish scribbles." The letter was burned. In the fire that night, Clara lay awake, staring at the dark, realizing how little of her belonged to her anymore. As spring ripened into summer, Emma's obsession grew more visible. She began to paint more often, locking herself in her study with Clara as the subject. Sometimes she painted Clara as she was sitting quietly, her hair pinned back, her hands folded. Other times, she painted her daughter in strange ways, altering her expression, darkening her eyes, making her appear older, almost otherworldly. Servants whispered about the portraits, about how they seemed to watch with too much life, as though Emma were trying to capture more than just an image. For Clara, the hours of sitting became unbearable. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the sound of the brush against canvas. Emma's eyes rarely left her daughter's face, searching, studying, as if she wanted to own not only her likeness but her very soul. The city itself added to the pressure. Dresden was changing in those years. Factories were rising, fortunes shifting, old families clinging tightly to their honor, while new wealth threatened to overshadow them. For Emma, the Voss name was everything. To her, Clara was not only a daughter, but the embodiment of that name, its future. She could not allow a single misstep, a single rumor. Already, whispers had reached her about families with daughters marrying in a trade, thereby lowering their standing for the sake of comfort and money. Emma would not let Clara fall into that trap. She guarded her as one might guard a jewel. But with each grip, Clara slipped further into despair. There were moments when Clara tried to resist. One evening at dinner, when Emma reminded her of her duty to the family, Clara dared to answer, "And what am I duty to myself?" The silence that followed was long and sharp. Emma did not shout. She did not strike her. Instead, she looked at her daughter with eyes so cold that Clara wished she had said nothing. Later, Clara overheard her mother speaking with the governess. "She forgets who she is. She forgets what she owes. I will not allow her to destroy everything." The servants noticed changes in both of them. Clara's once bright laughter had vanished entirely, replaced by quiet obedience. She moved through the halls like a shadow, her shoulders stooped, her eyes downcast. Emma, meanwhile, seemed more restless, more intense. She demanded more reports, asked more questions, pressed harder into every detail of her daughter's life. At night, servants passing her study would hear the scratch of brush and the mutter of words too soft to make out. The canvases piled up, each one stranger than the last. Clara with eyes that seemed to plead, Clara shrouded in black, Clara with a smile that looked forced and broken. By late summer, another pressure entered the picture. A suitor had begun to show interest in Clara, a young man from a respected family, connected by business and reputation. His name was Friedrich, polite and steady, with no obvious flaw. His visits were discreet, arranged through family friends. To him, Clara's beauty was enough. Her silence seemed grace, her gentleness charm. He spoke of her with admiration, unaware of the storm brewing beneath her quiet face. Emma's response was complicated. On the surface, she welcomed the match. It would preserve the family standing, tie their name to another of worth. But beneath that approval was something darker. The thought of Clara in another household, of her life belong, ing to someone else, filled Emma with dread she could not speak aloud. She praised Friedrich, yet afterward she clung tighter to her daughter, speaking of how unready she was, how fragile. "You are still mine," she said one night, her hand resting too firmly on Clara's arm. Clara did not answer, though the look in her eyes said enough. The strain between them deepened with every passing week. Friedrich's visits grew more frequent, his intentions clearer. Clara, though quiet, felt a strange hope stir within her. Marriage could be a way out, a door that might open into the life she longed for. Emma saw it too, and it filled her with fear masked as fury. Arguments grew sharper, though rarely loud. Emma's words cut deep, reminding Clara of loyalty, of duty, of the disgrace that awaited her if she chose wrong. Clara's silence became her only defense, though inside, her desperation grew. The past haunted Emma as well. Old grief pressed into her like a weight. Her husband's death, the loneliness that followed, the endless responsibility of keeping the Voss name intact. In Clara, she saw not only her child but the ghost of what she had lost. She convinced herself that holding Clara close was the same as keeping him alive, that letting her go would mean losing him forever. The line between love and possession blurred completely. By autumn, the estate felt more like a prison than a home. The leaves outside burned gold and red, but inside, the air was thick with unspoken words. Clara's health began to falter. She ate little, her face pale, her hands trembling. Servants whispered about her sadness, about the way she stood at windows as though waiting for escape. Emma, instead of easing, only tightened her grip, insisting that her daughter was weak, that she needed more care, more protection. The irony was lost on her, that the care itself was what was suffocating her. The final signs of fracture came in moments almost too small to notice. Clara began avoiding her mother's eyes, answering with nods instead of words. She kept her letters hidden better, tucked deep into places Emma had not yet searched. She lingered near Friedrich when she could, though always under her mother's gaze. Emma, meanwhile, became more erratic. Her painting grew frantic, her brushstrokes harsher. She spoke less to her servants, more to herself. She began locking her study door, as though guarding not just her work, but her mind. The house had become a place of silence, yet the silence was heavy with tension. Every glance, every pause, every word left unsaid added to the weight pressing down on both women. Those who lived there felt it, even if they could not name it. Something was coming. The line had stretched too far, and soon it would snap. The crime was not yet visible, not yet spoken, but its shadow had already entered the house. It lingered in Emma's restless eyes, in Clara's frail frame, in the canvases that stared too long from the walls. It hid in the air between mother and daughter, in every word of love that was more chain than comfort. And as the nights grew longer and the air colder once again, that shadow grew heavier, waiting for the moment it would finally take shape. The autumn of 1872 arrived with a heave. Why chill? The kind that seeps into the bones and lingers. The Voss estate, already cloaked in silence, grew darker still as the days shortened. Fires burned longer in the hearths, yet the warmth did little to soften the tension between mother and daughter. Each night, the house seemed to hold its breath. Servants tiptoed through corridors, carrying trays and stoking flames, but all eyes and ears were drawn to the upper floor, where Emma and Clara lived in a world entirely their own. And on the night it happened, a storm pressed against Dresden. Rain lashed against the windows. The river groaned beneath the weight of rising waters, and wind moaned around the corners of the stone house. Inside, Emma's study glowed with lamplight. Canvases lined the walls, unfinished portraits of Clara in varying forms, serene, sorrowful, lifeless. The smell of oil paint was thick, mixing with the damp of the storm. Emma had summoned her daughter there again, insisting she sit for yet another painting. Clara obeyed, though her body was weary, her spirit nearly broken. She sat in the chair by the window, the stormlight flickering across her face, while Emma stood at the easel, brush in hand, her eyes fixed on her daughter with an intensity that bordered on hunger. For hours, neither spoke. Only the scratching of brush against canvas filled the room, broken now and then by thunder rolling over the city. Clara's hands rested in her lap, fingers twisting together, her chest rising with uneven breaths. In her silence, there was not only obedience but desperation. Every muscle in her body screamed to leave, but she knew escape was impossible. Emma's hand trembled as she painted, her mind thick with thoughts she could not quiet. The suitor's visits, the whispers of marriage, the possibility of Clara leaving her. It all swirled in her head like the storm outside. Each stroke of paint felt like a battle to hold on to what was slipping away. She glanced at her daughter, her pale face glowing against the dark. A thought struck her. How fragile she looked, how fleeting. The fear of loss turned sharp inside her, twisting into something darker. The silence cracked when Clara spoke. Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight that shattered the air. "Mother," she said, eyes lowering to her lap. "I cannot do this anymore." Emma froze, brushed midair. "Do what?" she asked, though her tone carried danger, as if daring Clara to speak further. "Sit here. Pretend. Obey." Clara's voice quivered, but she pressed on. "I want to live. I want to leave this house. Friedrich, he wants to marry me. I want to go." The words landed like a knife. Emma's hand clenched around the brush, paint dripping to the floor. She turned slowly, her face pale with fury and fear. "Leave," she repeated, her voice low, shaking. "You speak as if you're free to decide. You're mine, Clara. Mine. Do you not understand? Everything I have given, everything I have lost, it is all for you. And you would throw it away for him." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she held her ground. "I'm not yours to keep." The storm howled against the glass as Emma's world collapsed in that single sentence. For years, she had bound her daughter in chains of duty, of devotion, believing it was love. Now, those chains were breaking. Panic surged through her chest, hot and wild. She dropped the brush, her breath ragged, and crossed the room in long strides. Clara rose, backing toward the window, her hands raised as though to ward her mother off. "Please," she whispered, "let me G." "Oh!" But Emma could not hear her pleas. All she saw was betrayal, abandonment, the shadow of being left alone again, as she had been when her husband died. The grief she had buried clawed its way back, merging with her obsession. The thought of Clara belonging to anyone else, of Clara walking away, was unbearable. The confrontation spun into chaos. Emma reached out, seizing Clara's arm with a grip so fierce it left marks. Clara cried out, tried to pull free, her body pressing against the cold glass of the window. The storm outside seemed to echo their struggle, thunder rattling the panes, rain streaming down like tears. Clara pushed back, desperation giving her strength. In her mother's eyes, she saw something unrecognizable, madness, sorrow, rage, all at once. "Do not leave me," Emma screamed, her voice breaking. "Mother, you're hurting me." Clara gasped, her voice thin with fear. In the frenzy, Emma's hand moved to her daughter's throat, fingers trembling as they tightened. It was not planned, not thought through. It was instinct, the desperate grasp of someone who cannot bear to let go. Clara's eyes widened in shock, her breath caught, her hands clawing at her mother's arms. The struggle was brief but brutal. Clara's frail body could not withstand the force of Emma's grief-fueled strength. Within moments, her legs gave way, her movements slowed, and the light in her eyes flickered. When it was over, the room fell silent but for the storm. Clara's body slumped to the floor, her dark hair spilling across the wood, her face pale in the lamplight. Emma stood above her, chest heaving, hands shaking, the weight of what she had done pressing in with crushing force. She knelt, touching her daughter's cheek, whispering her name, but there was no answer. For a long time, she did not move. The world had narrowed to the still figure at her feet, the sound of rain against the glass, the acrid smell of oil paint. Panic clawed her chest, but alongside it was denial, a voice whispering that this could not be real. She pressed her ear to Clara's chest, searching for breath, for a heartbeat. Nothing. The truth hit her like a blade. She had destroyed the very thing she could not live without. Her cries filled the room, muffled by the storm. She wept, rocking her daughter's body, murmuring apologies, words of love twisted by the crime. "You are mine," she whispered again and again, as if repeating it might undo what had happened. Then came the rationalizations, the frantic attempts to make sense of it. It had been an accident, she told herself. Clara had pushed, struggled, and forced her hand. She had only wanted to hold her, to stop her from leaving. She had not meant for this. Yet even as she thought it, She knew the truth, that her need to possess had destroyed what she loved most. Fear set in. The servants would hear. Questions would come. Whispers would spread. The Voss name would be ruined. Emma's grief shifted swiftly into a cold resolve. She rose, wiping her face, and looked around the room. The canvases stared back at her, Clara's painted faces watching with haunting eyes. She felt them accusing her, or worse, bearing silent witness. She could not let the world see Clara like this. Not in disgrace, not in death. The thought struck her like lightning. She would preserve her, keep her beauty intact, even in death. She would turn her into a portrait, one final masterpiece, so the world would remember her as Emma wished, as perfect, eternal, untouchable. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the crime had already shifted from chaos to concealment. Emma's grief-stricken love had become something else entirely, a determinate. Ion to shape even her daughter's memory, to control her not only in life but beyond it. And so the house, heavy with silence, became a tomb for more than just Clara's body. It became a tomb for the truth, for the innocence lost, for the line between love and obsession that had been crossed with fatal hands. The storm passed by dawn, leaving the Voss estate washed in pale light, its windows streaked with rain, its gardens heavy with broken branches and wet leaves. Inside, the house was unnaturally still. The servants moved about in hushed tones, sensing something was wrong, though none dared name it. Emma remained in her study, the door locked, her presence marked only by the faint smell of oil paint seeping through the cracks and the silence that pressed against the hall out on the floor of that room. Clara's body lay covered by a sheet. Emma had spent the night beside her, first in sobs, then in long stretches of silence, her mind fraying under the weight of what she had done. Her thoughts circled endlessly, grief, panic, justification. She told herself it had not been murder. Clara had resisted, had forced her hand. It was not cruelty, only desperation. The words repeated in her head, but they brought no peace. Each time she looked at her daughter's still face, denial shattered. The truth clawed its way back. She had taken the life she had sworn to protect. Yet Emma was not ready to let the world see that truth. By morning, she began to work, her movements mechanical, as though some other force guided her. She brought out her paints, her brushes, and a new canvas. She sat before Clara's body, the sheet pulled back, and began to paint. Her hands trembled, her tears fell onto the canvas, but still she worked, determined to capture every detail of her daughter's face, every shadow, every flicker of light that memory might soon erase. Hours passed this way. The servants knock. Ked, asking if she required anything. She answered only with sharp commands to leave her be. When the portrait was finished, she stared at it with hollow eyes. It was beautiful, but it was also terrifying. Clara looked alive, yet she was not. The painting seemed less a tribute than a possession, as though Emma had stolen her daughter's soul and trapped it in the paint. She convinced herself it was an act of devotion, that Clara would live forever this way, perfect and untouched. But beneath that thought was another, darker one. Emma had not preserved her daughter for Clara's sake, but for her own. The servants eventually discovered the truth. When one of the maids finally pushed open the study door in fear, she found Emma cradling the finished portrait, her dress stained with paint, her face streaked with tears. The girl's body lay stiff on the floor, her skin cold. The maid screamed, drawing others. So, the household was in chaos, whispers spreading like wildfire. By evening, the city knew. News of Clara's death hit Dresden with a shock that rippled through every circle of society. The Voss family was well known, respected, and their name was tied to centuries of history. The story carried by word of mouth was softened at first. An illness, a sudden weakness, the frailty of a girl too delicate for this world. But rumors grew quickly. Servants from the estate spoke in hushed voices at markets, their words slipping out like poisoned secrets. They spoke of the arguments, the strange paintings, the storm that had shaken the house. Soon whispers reached ears beyond the city, casting doubt on the purity of the Voss name. Emma did not leave her house in the days that followed. She wore black, her face hidden by a veil, and drifted from room to room like a shadow. Grief was expected, and to those who came to pay respects, she seemed every inch the grieving mother. But in private, the reality was far from ordinary mourning. At night, she sat before the portrait, speaking into it as though Clara could hear, her words filled with apology and possession. "You are still with me," she whispered. "You will never leave." The suitor, Friedrich, was struck hardest outside the estate. When he heard of Clara's sudden death, he was devastated. To him, she had been a fragile promise of love, a hope for the future. He visited the Voss estate once, but Emma refused him entry, insisting the family's grief was too great. He never saw Clara's body. He returned home in silence, but his sorrow turned quickly to suspicion. He remembered the way Emma's eyes had watched them, the way Clara had grown more withdrawn with each visit. Though he never spoke it aloud in public, he confided to friends that something in that house was deeply wrong. The city, too, began to look at Emma differently. Once admired for her strength and her composure, she was now viewed with unease. The sight of her in black, thin and pale, clutching the portrait of her daughter, inspired pity in some, horror in others. Whispers called her a woman consumed, a mother who could not let go, perhaps even one who had hastened her daughter's end. But the Voss name still held weight, and in the absence of proof, society stopped short of open accusation. Still, Emma's world was crumbling. Her staff began to leave one by one, unable to bear the atmosphere of the house. They spoke of strange sounds at night, Emma whispering to the painting, her voice rising and falling as if she argued with it. They claimed she would sit for hours before it, unmoving, her face lit by candlelight, her shadow stretched long across the walls. Some swore the painting itself had changed, that Clara's eyes followed them, that her expression seemed to shift with the mood of the room. Whether truth or imagination, the whispers only deepened the sense of dread surrounding the estate. Emma herself was hollowed by guilt and madness. She clung to justifications, telling herself again that it had been an accident, that Clara had forced her hand, but the weight never lifted. At times, she broke down completely, kneeling before the portrait, confessing her crime in sobs. Other times, she convinced herself she had done nothing wrong, that Clara was still with her, more perfectly than ever. The contradiction tore at her mind, driving her further into isolation. The community distanced itself. Families who once sought her company stopped sending invitations. Friedrich's family severed ties entirely. The Voss estate, once a place of gatherings and prestige, became a house no one wished to enter. Emma's reputation shifted from respected matron to a figure of whispered dread, a woman swallowed by her own grief and secrets, and yet no law ever touched her. Without witnesses, without evidence, Clara's death remained officially unexplained, attributed to a sudden illness. The authorities did not pry into a family of such standing, and Emma gave them no reason to. She buried her daughter quietly, with only a small ceremony attended by a handful of relatives. But even at the graveside, she did not release Clara. She clutched the portrait, her face blank, as if the body in the ground were less real than the painted likeness she held close. In the weeks that followed, the estate decayed. Dust gathered, rooms went unused, the air grew heavy. Emma lived only for the painting. She spoke to it, dined before it, even slept in its shadow. Servants who remained claimed she no longer saw the difference between the living and the painted, that she believed Clara was still there, answering her in silence. The aftermath of the crime was not a trial or scandal played out in courts. It was a slow unraveling, a punishment carried not by law, but by grief and madness. Emma had taken in her daughter's life in a moment of desperation, and in doing so, she had imprisoned herself in a house filled with silence, shadows, and the gaze of a portrait that never looked away. The tragedy of Clara Voss's death closed like a heavy curtain, leaving the city of Dresden haunted by whispers and unanswered questions. Time did not erase the event, but transformed it, shifting it from immediate scandal into a cautionary tale that clung to the name Voss for generations. If for those closest to the crime, Emma herself, Friedrich, and the dwindling Voss household, the fallout was more than rumor or reputation. It was a slow undoing, each life bent under the weight of grief, guilt, and the silence of what could never be spoken aloud. Emma Voss never stood trial. There were no judges, no juries, no official declarations of guilt. Clara's death was recorded as sudden, unexplained, and a tragedy attributed to delicate health and misfortune. The Voss name, though frayed, was still too powerful to be openly challenged. But though the law never touched her, Emma carried within her the heaviest sentence imaginable. She became prisoner to her own act, shackled not in chains but in memory. Her once commanding presence diminished into a frail shadow of itself. In the final years of her life, she was rarely seen beyond the walls of her decaying estate. The grand halls of the Voss house fell silent, its windows shuttered, its gardens overgrown. Emma spent her days in the study where Clara's portrait hung, her life revolving around that canvas. To those few who glimpsed her, she seemed consumed, speaking to the painting as though it were flesh, chastising it, pleading with it, weeping before I in this sense. Justice was served in a manner far crueler than a courtroom could impose. Emma's punishment was perpetual confrontation, the inescapable gaze of her daughter, fixed in pigment and oil, reminding her of both love and crime. To the world, she was a grieving mother. To herself, she was executioner and captive alike. Friedrich, Clara's suitor, bore the burden of suspicion without proof. His grief was entangled with bitterness, for he suspected truths that he could never prove. To him, Clara's death had been preventable, even deliberate. The memory of Emma's sharp disapproval haunted him, and though he never voiced his accusations publicly, he distanced himself from the Voss family forever. His eventual marriage to another was shadowed by Clara's ghost, and though he built a family of his own, he carried into his later years a quiet, unshakable sense of betrayal by a society that protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. For the servants who had lived within the Voss estate, the aftermath was equally scarring. Those who remained in Emma's service described a house that felt alive with unease, where silence pressed against the walls and shadows seemed to linger too long. Many left, unable to bear the atmosphere, and those who stayed were changed, speaking in hushed tones of the portrait that watched them, of the mistress who no longer recognized the line between life and paint. They, too, were victims of the crime, trapped in the orbit of a woman unraveling, in Dresden. Clara's death marked a turning point in how the Voss name was spoken. Where once the family embodied power and refinement, whispers of corruption and decay began to cling to them. The official story of illness satisfied the polite classes on the surface, but beneath the veneer of civility, suspicion thrived. The Voss estate became a place of unease, avoided in conversation and in presence. Children dared one another to run past its gates at night, while their parents lowered their voices when speaking of Emma. As years passed, the story of Clara's death was reshaped by rumor, retelling, and imagination. To some, she became a tragic young woman taken too soon by fate. To others, she was a victim of MOT, hers obsession and control. The truth, never spoken aloud, remained trapped in the portrait, a truth known fully only to Emma and the silence of her walls. The Voss tragedy illuminated uncomfortable truths about power, silence, and justice. It revealed how wealth and reputation could insulate individuals from scrutiny, allowing certain crimes to disappear into the shadows. In the absence of legal reckoning, society was forced to reckon instead with rumor and unease, a different kind of justice, one that lived in whispers rather than LAW. That IT also raised questions about motherhood, control, and the dangerous boundary between love and possession. Emma's act was born not of hatred, but of desperation, yet desperation twisted into something darker. Her refusal to allow Clara independence, Her belief that she could preserve perfection by force revealed a chilling truth. Love, when warped by fear and control, can become indistinguishable from cruelty. In the broader cultural imagination, the tale became a warning. It was whispered in parlors and scrawled in private diaries. The danger of unchecked power within the home, the way silence could shield cruelty, and the ease with which society turned its gaze away when the guilty bore a name too respected to tarnish its core. The story of Emma and Clara was not only about a crime, but about the human condition. It reflected the fragility of morality under pressure, how love can become possession, and the devastating consequences of unchecked authority within intimate relationships. Emma's downfall was not sudden, but gradual, an erosion of moral boundaries justified by fear, culminating in a single irreversible act. Her story forced others to confront unsettling questions. At what point does love become tyranny? When does protection cross into imprisonment? And when those in power, be it familial, social, or economic, commit harm, what mechanisms exist to hold them accountable? The tragedy also underscored the human tendency towards silence in the face of discomfort. Servants who suspected wrongdoing remained quiet, bound by fear or loyalty. Neighbors looked away, unwilling to question a family of such stature. The community's complicity, born of hesitation and self-preservation, allowed the crime to remain unpunished. In the end, Clara's death was not remembered as a scandal to be prosecuted, but as a wound that lingered in collective memory. Emma's fate was not written in court records, but in the decay of her estate, in the whispered tales of servants, and in the mournful eyes of a suitor left with unanswered questions. The portrait endured, silent, unchanging, both tribute and prison. Justice, in its legal sense, was never served. But justice of another kind. A justice of memory, of rumor, of moral reckoning, outlived Emma herself. Her name became a warning, her house a symbol, her portrait a ghost that no prayer or candlelight could banish. The story leaves us with no easy resolution, only a reminder of the complexity of human nature. Love and fear can intertwine until they're inseparable. Power, when left unchecked, corrodes the soul. And silence, whether born of fear, loyalty, or convenience, can allow unspeakable acts to flourish unseen. In reflecting on the Voss tragedy, one sees not only the fall of a mother and daughter, but the reflection of broader truths, the fragility of morality, the weight of guilt, and the enduring consequences of choices. That cannot be undone. It is a story not only of death, but of the shadows that remain when truth is buried, and the uneasy silence that lingers when justice is left unspoken.